The most valuable find in British archaeology wasn't decided in the dig. It was decided 3 weeks later in a village coroner's courtroom. Picture the room, a wood-paneled hall in Sutton, Suffolk, late August 1939. Hitler's tanks are days from Poland, and 14 jurors are being asked one question that will shape every museum case you've ever stood in front of. Who owns a king's gold? The widow whose land it sat under for 1,300 years? Or the Crown of England? They call it the concealed intent test. Here's what the textbook tells you. Basil Brown digs a mound on Edith Pretty's estate. He finds the ghost of a 90-foot ship pressed into the sand. Inside, a burial chamber stuffed with gold buckles, garnet shoulder clasps, the iron helmet that becomes the face of Anglo-Saxon England. The textbook then jumps straight to the British Museum. The treasure is there. End of story. But there's a missing 3 weeks between the trench and the display case. And in those 3 weeks, Edith Pretty almost lost everything she'd just paid to uncover. The law the Crown leaned on was old and brutal. Treasure trove. If a hoard had been deliberately hidden by someone who meant to come back for it, it belonged to the king. If it had been openly abandoned, or buried as a gift to the dead, it belonged to the landowner. That's the concealed intent test in one sentence. Hidden on purpose, Crown wins. Left on purpose, finder wins. You're probably already running the calculation. A ship, a body, a king sent off with his sword. Does that look like a man planning to come back? It didn't. On the 14th of August, 1939, the Sutton coroner's jury ruled that the Sutton Hoo treasure was not treasure trove. The whole hoard belonged to Edith Pretty, the wealthiest single discovery in the country's history, handed to a widow in a wood-paneled room by 14 of her neighbors. And here is the dinner table fact you now own. Pretty gave all of it to the nation within weeks. The biggest private gift the British Museum has ever received. She refused the honor she was offered for it. She wanted the gold remembered, not herself. War was declared 3 weeks later. So the gold was saved, the law was settled, and the ship in the sand had a legal owner at last. But the harder question was still sitting in the trench. Whose ship was it? The jury had ruled on ownership in 1939. They could not rule on identity, because the body, the king, the gold was sent off with, was missing. No skeleton, no teeth, no bone. Just an empty stain where a man should have been. The strangest part of Sutton Hoo doesn't come until the river. And the river is next. But the records tell a different story about what was actually pulled from that trench. Because nothing was pulled from it. Not the king, not the ship, not even the wood the ship was built from. Suffolk soil is acid, properly acid. The kind that eats bone, eats oak, eats leather, eats hair. Anything organic that went into Mound 1 was gone by the time anyone arrived to look. So the most famous ship burial in Europe was, on the day they opened it, a hole full of sand. That's the puzzle. Here's what was left. Iron rivets, hundreds of them, sitting exactly where the planking had rotted out from around them. And the sand itself, packed against vanished oak for 13 centuries, had hardened into the shape of the hull. A perfect impression, a 27-metre ghost. You weren't looking at a ship. You were looking at the hole a ship used to be. Archaeologists call this a negative. The object is missing, but the space it occupied is signed and dated. Like footprints in wet cement, except the foot is gone. Now you're probably wondering about the body. The king. The whole point of the burial. And this is where the textbook version skips a step. Because there was no skeleton, no teeth, no skull, no silhouette pressed into the sand, the way the ship was, just empty. For decades, that absence was a problem. Some scholars argued there had never been a body at all, that Mound 1 was a cenotaph, a memorial to a king buried somewhere else. Others said the acid had simply finished the job. Both camps had a point. The answer came in 1967, and it came from chemistry. Researchers tested the soil for phosphate, the chemical signature a decomposing body leaves behind, even after every bone is gone. The readings inside Mound 1 spiked. A man had lain there. The acid had dissolved him down to a stain you could only see with a beaker. Call it chemical photography. The famous sand-shaped figures tourists picture? Those belong to other graves at the site, the execution burials, Mound 17. Mound 1's king was proved by a test tube, so the ship was a ghost. The king was a ghost. The only solid things in the trench were rivets and gold. And the gold is where this gets stranger, because the gold did not stay quiet. Garnets cut in Sri Lanka, coins struck in Frankish mints, silver from the eastern Mediterranean. Every object in that hole had a passport, and the passports do not match the story Anglo-Saxon England is supposed to tell. A man dissolved into nothing, left behind a trade route. And the trade route is where we go next. Here's the thing nobody told you about the Sutton Hoo gold. The king who wore it lasted about 40 years before the soil ate him. The garnets on his shoulder clasps have lasted 1400, and those stones did not grow in any English field. A 2007 gemological study traced them to mines in India and Sri Lanka. So, a man who vanished into chemistry left behind a pile of evidence that crossed 3 continents to reach him. The body is gone. The receipts stayed. The textbook calls this period the Dark Ages. Lights out, trade dead, Europe shrunk into muddy villages waiting for the Normans. The hoard says otherwise. Silver bowls from Byzantium. Coins from 37 separate Frankish mints, dated tight enough to bracket the burial inside a single decade. Garnets sourced through Persian middlemen. Every object carries a postmark. Lay them on a map, and you draw a supply chain reaching from Suffolk to Sri Lanka through the supposedly broken bones of the Roman world. The trade routes did not die. They just stopped writing letters. You're probably wondering how anyone proves a garnet came from Sri Lanka and not, say, Bohemia. The answer is trace chemistry, basically a fingerprint of impurities locked inside the stone when it formed. Match the fingerprint to a mine, you have provenance. Curator Sue Brunning at the British Museum has lifted some of these pieces out from behind the glass for handling. She describes the shoulder clasps as warm, heavier than you expect. The gold worked so tightly, the garnets sit flush as pixels. The textbook word for this period is collapse. The object in your hand says network. So here is the shareable thing. The Sutton Hoo hoard is an ancient hard drive. Each artifact is a stored record of a supplier, a route, a contract honored across a continent. The Dark Ages were not dark for whoever ordered these stones. Someone in 7th century Suffolk had a working address book that reached Constantinople and beyond, and the postage went through. The reason the period looks empty is that the records were written in metal and stone, not parchment, and we were reading the wrong medium. The data was sitting in the dirt, which raises an awkward question. If a small English court could afford garnets from Sri Lanka, what kind of operation was this, exactly? Not a backwater, not a holdout, something organized enough to commission a 27-metre ship, fill it with imported wealth, and bury the lot under a mound visible from the river. The hoard tells us the trade worked. It does not tell us who ran it, or why they buried their balance sheet in the ground. For that, we have to look at the ship itself and at the man who finally read it. Start with the spine. This hull had no deep keel. It rode on a broad keel plank, built up from massive oak timbers scarfed end to end. The central run alone, close to 14 meters. Clear, straight oak in those lengths was cathedral-grade scarcity in the 7th century. You didn't waste it on a boat you intended to bury. Yet, that is exactly what they did. The standard telling, the Netflix film, the listicle ranking the helmet at number 3 of Britain's top 10 treasures, keeps your eye on the gold. It misses the bigger object the gold was sitting inside. The ship is the artifact. The gold is the cargo. Look at what it took to make. Oak strakes laid plank over plank in the clinker style. Every overlap riveted with iron. Every seam packed with tarred wool. The sand preserved the marks of 14 pairs of tholes, the oar pivots, with the midships left open for the burial chamber, putting the crew somewhere between 28 and 40 oarsmen. No mast step, no keelson for a sail. This hull was rowed. A ship this size could move a small army. The Durham research record on the burial puts the labor in the realm of hundreds of skilled days. You don't sink that into a grave by accident. Here's where the textbook reading wobbles. If the point was to honor the dead, a symbolic boat would have done a model, a prow, a few ceremonial planks. Plenty of Anglo-Saxon graves use exactly that shorthand. Mound 1 didn't. They dragged a functioning vessel uphill from the river, set it in a trench cut to fit, built a timber chamber inside it, and roofed the whole thing under a mound visible for miles. That is not symbolism. That is engineering. You're probably wondering what kind of journey needed a real ship instead of a token one. The answer reframes the whole site. This wasn't a boat. It was a launch vehicle. Every choice, the load-bearing keel, the sealed chamber, the imported cargo packed in for the trip points at a craft built to carry one passenger out of this world and into the next. Call it the Wooden Spacecraft. The king we think was Radwald of East Anglia, who died around 624, wasn't being remembered. He was being dispatched. The mound is the gantry. The river below is the runway. The ship is the engine that gets him gone. That reframing only works if someone could read the hull well enough to see it. In 1939, the oak was already vapor-only iron rivets, and a sand impression remained, the negative shape we met earlier. Reading a ship that no longer exists, from rivet patterns alone, takes a particular kind of mind, not a credentialed one. The man who did it had no degree, no museum post, and was paid laborer's wages by Edith Pretty's estate. The British establishment nearly wrote him out of the story entirely. His name was about to matter. And then, in the summer of 2024, the spades came back. 85 years after the famous trench, archaeologists cut new ground at Sutton, not on the mounds, but in the field next door. They call it the Garden Field. The textbook version of this site ends at the ship. The evidence says the textbook stopped reading too early. Most people picture Sutton as one trench, one king, one moment. Turns out, the king was the last chapter of a much older book. The garden field sits just yards from Mound 1, in a stretch nobody had touched. Time Team official documented the season as the trowels went in, and the soil immediately began talking. Post holes, hearth scatter, domestic debris from generations before any royal mound rose. The site wasn't an empty heath waiting for a king. It was already a working landscape, fences, fires, daily life, when the burial mound builders showed up. The shareable nugget is simple. Before Sutton was a royal cemetery, it was somebody's backyard. You're probably wondering how the diggers know the order. The answer is stratigraphy, basically reading the soil like tree rings, where older stuff sits underneath younger stuff. The garden field layers run the wrong way for the textbook timeline. The pre-royal occupation phase lies beneath the mound-era surface, sealed by it. That means the kings didn't found this place. They inherited it, and they chose it on purpose. Which raises the harder question. If the ground was already spoken for, why drag a 27-metre ship up here, of all the ridges in East Anglia? The reveal lands quietly. The pre-royal community at Sutton wasn't random Iron Age leftovers. The finds suggest continuity of meaning. The spot was already significant to the people living on it, long before a king was loaded into a hull. The mound builders weren't claiming empty land. They were claiming sacred ground that already belonged to somebody else's ancestors. That's the move. You don't bury a wooden spacecraft on a stranger's hill. You bury it on a hill the local dead already approved of. Sutton was chosen, not founded, which leaves the long loop we opened at the very start the strangest part, the one tied to the river. The garden field tells us why this ridge. It doesn't tell us why a ship, a functional road vessel, dragged uphill from tidewater, sealed into earth on ground that was already spiritually claimed. The king's body is gone, dissolved into chemistry. The ship points away from the river. The man who first read all of this, in worn boots and laborer's wages, has been waiting 4 chapters for his name. What if the only honest way to know what those people could do was to put down the textbook and pick up their axe? That is exactly what a group in Suffolk has decided. They call themselves the Sutton Ships Company, and they are not building a model. They are felling oaks, splitting planks, and shaping a full 27-metre warship by hand. No power tools, no steel saws, just period-accurate iron axes swung by modern arms. The hoard told us they were rich. The replica is asking a harder question. Were they capable? You are probably picturing a small wooden boat in a shed. It is not that. It is the same length as a tennis court, plank by plank, the same vanished hull whose rivets were read out of the sand. Every plank gets riven, split along the grain with wedges the way the original shipwrights did it, because sawing across the grain breaks the wood's strength. A single oak yields a handful of usable boards. The team has been at this for years. The build is slow because the 7th century was slow. That pace is the data. Here is where the textbook gets quietly embarrassed. The standard story treats the Dark Ages as a long pause, lights off, skills lost, waiting for the next civilization to switch them back on. But every hour the replica crew spends with an Anglo-Saxon axe is an hour spent proving that the joinery, the metallurgy, the geometry of a clinker hull, none of it was crude. The tools demand a trained hand. The hand implies a trade. The trade implies an economy that taught it. You cannot have this ship in a vacuum. The mound is the receipt for a working culture. And this is the payoff the gold could never give us. The hoard proves wealth. The replica proves competence, measurable, repeatable, in foot-pounds and plank yields. Durham's research group has tracked the labor figures, and the numbers line up with what the original burial would have cost in human hours. The Dark Ages were never dark. They were just illegible to anyone who refused to read them in wood and iron instead of ink. Call it reverse engineering a slander. The replica is the rebuttal. The period never got to write for itself. Which brings us back, finally, to the man in worn boots. Basil Brown was a self-taught Suffolk excavator on laborers' wages when he read a vanished ship out of rust patterns in 1939. The credentialed establishment arrived later, took the trench, and nearly took the credit. He understood the hull because he understood the people who built it, not as primitives, but as engineers. The replica crew today is doing the same work with axes. Brown did it with a trowel and a guess that turned out to be the only one in the room worth listening to.